There we go. Can everybody hear me? I hope the handouts have been helpful this quarter. In chapter 11, it's really important that you kind of look at the handout and follow along, because we're looking at some very detailed history that's revealed to Daniel and covers a period of several hundred years that he's given very detailed information on about the events that are going to happen. But you call in chapter 9 of Daniel, he read the prophecy from Jeremiah, and then he understood that the 70 years of captivity were about to come to an end. And that prompted this amazing prayer, one of the most amazing prayers in the Bible, compelling prayers. As he's praying, Gabriel came to him, and it said he came in swift flight. And the Hebrew there really means he came like he was out of breath. He came so quickly. And then he revealed to him the prophecy of the 70 weeks that we talked about earlier. And then Dan covered chapter 10, the last two lessons, and that was just a couple of years after the events of chapter 9. And of course, Daniel received another vision, this great conflict, and the text says he understood the word and had understanding of the vision. And that prompted him to undergo a period of 3 weeks of mourning where he ate no delicacies and no wine, and he was just really in a sad situation, probably concerned about the events that were happening in Jerusalem as the captives had gone back to Jerusalem. As you recall, we had a great understanding of the spiritual battle that was going on in the background, and it said that the angelic being, it was delayed for 3 weeks by the prince of Persia. It's exactly the same time that Daniel was mourning. So in chapter 9, Gabriel came quickly. In chapter 10, he was delayed during the time that Daniel was mourning. It was just super interesting to read chapter 10 and see that spiritual battle that was going on in the background in the kingdom of men. Tonight we're going to see a super detailed prophecy, and it's very detailed, and I know, and I'm challenged as we look at that everyone's eyes doesn't glaze over as we go through this verse by verse and look at the events in history. But it's really important for us to understand that God is active in this world. Deism is a philosophy that's really difficult to make a discrete statement about it, but really, if we were kind of sum it up, they believe that God is simply a great watchmaker. He created the universe. He established the laws of the universe, and he fixed all the gears as a great watchmaker would, and then he just sat back and watched everything happen. And of course, as we read Daniel, and we especially chapter 11, and we see the unfolding of history over a period of hundreds of years in the future in great, great detail, it's hard to understand how anyone could have a view of God like that God is active and he is sovereign. The psalmists talk about God being sovereign over all, that he does whatever he pleases. He does in heaven and earth, in all the depths, whatever he pleases. And as you recall in Nebuchadnezzar's confession in chapter 4, after he'd been humbled as a beast, he said of God that he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" So that's one of the things it's a great takeaway from Daniel, is that God is active and his plan will come to fruition. So as we explore those, chapter 11, I think our great takeaway is not that we remember all of this and we can just pick it up and look at this in the future and remember every single event that's happening and that sort of thing. But we need to remember that God is sovereign over his creation. God knows what's going to happen. It's his plan. And I also want us to think about, as we talk about the kings of the north and the kings of the south and these battles that are going on, here's tiny Jerusalem and Israel caught in the middle between these superpowers. And God wants them to be dependent on him, and yet we really see how they come to be dependent on the nations around them, who is the most gracious towards them. Galatians chapter 4 speaks about the fullness of time. And Jesus in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 talked about the time of the Gentiles when Jerusalem would be trampled underfoot. That's what we're reading about here in Daniel chapter 11. So before we start our class, let's go to God in a word of prayer, and then we'll dive into the text. Heavenly Father, we count it a blessing to have this quiet time in the middle of the week to open your word and consider how great you are. To consider your servant Daniel, who was greatly loved by you, and to consider the revelation you presented to Daniel about the events in history that would lead up to the time of Jesus and to his great redemptive work and to his eternal kingdom. As we consider the events of chapter 11, Lord, please help us to be impressed with your sovereignty and your active role in the lives of men. This is such a difficult text that describes events in history that most of us are unfamiliar with. We ask for your blessing on us as we read through this text, and help us to see the big picture and appreciate the Christ and his kingdom that transcends all the things that we deal with here on earth and the spiritual battles that rage in the background. Again, we ask for your blessings on our class. We ask these things in your Son's name. Amen. I'm just going to read the first 14 verses of Daniel chapter 11. So join with me as we read that, and then we'll kind of break down the text and look at this and help us understand better what was revealed to Daniel. Verse 2, I'm going to start in verse 2 as Dan taught in our last class. Verse 1 of chapter 11 really should belong with chapter 10. We're going to start in verse 2. And now I shall show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not with his posterity, not according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others beside these. Verse 5, then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure, but she shall be given up in her attendants, he who fathered her and he who supported her in those times. Verse 7, and from a branch from her root one shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. He shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold. And for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. Then the latter shall come into the realm of the kings of the south, but shall return to his own land. His son shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north, and he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. For the king of the north shall again raise a multitude greater than the first. And after some years, he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. In those times, many shall rise against the king of the south, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. In your handouts, you should have a chronological order of the visions. And of course, this is the last vision that Daniel interprets, and it's started in chapter 10, and it moves through chapter 11 over into the first part of chapter 12. And of course, in chapter 10, the angel came to him and said, "Don't be afraid." He had come to make him understand. And so chapter 11 expands on what we studied in chapter 10. You know, as we often talk about this, the intertestamental period, or this period of silence, this 400 years of silence. And of course, Malachi, the final prophet, prophesied about 430 BC, and that would have been under Artaxerxes. And we talk about this period of silence after that. And then it's silent until John the Baptist comes in the New Testament, and Malachi prophesied about Elijah, John, referring to John the Baptist. But these 400 years weren't silent. They were revealed to Daniel. And this information was relayed to Daniel. And of course, Jesus refers back to Daniel in Matthew chapter 24 when he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So we should be aware that Jesus is pointing us back to Daniel and the things that were revealed to Daniel. Just want to make you, this can be a really difficult history. Most of us weren't educated or studied this ancient period of time, and so it can be really difficult to us. And as we read this, and I'll try and point it out as we go, it's not unusual to discuss or see events revealed to Daniel, and then the text skip ahead 20 or 50 or even 100 years. It just skips a period of time and goes to the more significant periods of time. There are some really helpful extra biblical sources that as you read this and try to study this in more detail. Josephus, the Jewish historian, has some really good information that fill in the blanks that we're reading here in Daniel 11. The book of Maccabees, of course, in the Catholic Bible, you see 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and I think in the Eastern Orthodox Church, 1st, and these aren't canonical books, but they are like historical commentaries, and Maccabees is a great source to help understand the time of the Maccabean revolt and the things we get a little bit further in that reveal some of these things, and they all correlate really well with the text we read in Daniel chapter 11. And then the Greek historian Polybus, who wrote The Rise of Rome, it's also a great source as you try to fill in the blanks as we read through this text of Daniel and really help you understand what is going on in this amazing prophecy. One of the things I want us to keep in mind is you'll see some dates. We'll talk about some dates. It's about 534 BC when Daniel is receiving this vision. And we're going to be talking about things that happen all the way up to the time of Christ. So he's literally being told about events in great detail that will happen hundreds of years in the future. So I hope you can see the screen. I think it's in your handout. But if you break down Daniel chapter 11, the verses 2 through 4 deal with the Persian and Greek. Of course, Daniel is now living in the Persian Empire under Cyrus, and the Greek kingdom is not too far in the future. But then the majority of the text in Daniel chapter 11, verses 5 through 39, deal with 6 Syrian wars. That's between the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemies in Egypt. And that's from 274 BC down to 168. And then, of course, you say there's not very much on verses 2 through 4 in the Persian and Greek empires, but if you recall, there was a lot revealed to us in Daniel chapter 8 about the Alexander the Great and the Greeks. So there's been a great deal of emphasis already placed on that. As we get down to verses 40 through 45, it deals with the Roman Empire coming up to the time of the Messiah. And as I pointed out, the vision really doesn't end until the first part of chapter 12. So it spills over into chapter 12. So the Seleucid Empire is the area that we would think of as Syria or modern-day Iraq, and of course the Ptolemies in Egypt, and there's little Jerusalem caught in the middle. In the area between that is the battleground that we'll be talking about a lot is called Kole Syria, and that's the area that's kind of modern-day Lebanon and Syria that's in the that separates these two great powers. And of course, if we read the text, the kings of the north are either named Seleucus or Antiochus. And all the Ptolemies are pretty easy to keep up with because it's Ptolemy the first, Ptolemy the second. And there's just the numbers just go, so they're all Ptolemy. But this is the kings of the north and the kings of the south that we will read about a lot in Daniel. And there's another slide. You can just look and see that area, Colay, Syria. That's the battleground between these two great empires. And that's just from Damascus a little farther north and east that separate these two great empires, and winds up being a battleground that goes between these two. And of course, Daniel had been told about these wars and conflicts, and that's what we're reading about today. So we'll move to verse 2 of chapter 11. In the text, and now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Well, of course, he's receiving this vision under the time of Cyrus. You know, Darius the Mede and Cyrus, we've talked about that. But Cyrus ruled down to about 530, and he was replaced by his son Cambyses. And then we have Pseudo-Smyrtus. He only lasts about a year, and he's murdered. Then Darius the Great from 522 to 486, and then Xerxes from 486 to 464. And Xerxes is likely the husband of Esther that we read about in the Old Testament. So this text just fits perfectly. It's not difficult to understand. There'll be 3 more kings shall arise, and a fourth will be greater. These are his successors. And this is just a period of about 50 to 70 years from the time that Daniel receives the vision. So this is near future events that he's experiencing then. And of course, the Persian Empire was an amazing empire, and it lasted from about 550 to 330 BC. It lasted over 200 years. And so it was, and it's amazing. We've seen slides and talked about this as we've gone through the archaeological evidences that we find, the Cyrus cylinder and different things. It's just amazing that we can go back and see all these things revealed to us in history. Then as we move to verse 3, notice verse 3 starts with the word then. We're jumping ahead 100 years ahead in history now. This is not, it's not just this king. We've jumped 100 years ahead, and it's jumped from Xerxes to Alexander the Great. Then a mighty king shall arise, and he shall rule with a great dominion, speaking of Alexander the Great, and do as he wills. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others beside these. So we've skipped ahead 100 years. Of course, Alexander conquers almost all the world, from Greece all the way over almost to China, over into the eastern side of India. He's just down into Egypt, all of modern-day Turkey. He's conquered all that in 11 years, and we talked about it a little bit when we were in chapter 8. And of course, he's wounded in a battle, and we don't know exactly how he died, but he died shortly thereafter. And his kingdom winds up being divided amongst his 4 generals. There's a slide just to remind us the great empire he created in a matter of 11 years, 11 short years. And but his kingdom wasn't divided up amongst his children or anything like that. It was divided amongst his generals. And so all these things we're reading about in verse 4, his kingdom will be broken and divided. This all references to the generals that ruled under him. And there were 4 great generals, and when it says it's divided amongst the 4 winds of heaven, it was like the points on the compass, north, south, east, and west. They covered the whole area. And we had Cassander that was ruling in Macedonia and the Greek peninsula. We had Antigonus and Lysimachus, and he was ruling in the area of what we would think is modern-day Turkey, up in, when we think of Thrace, that's just the area kind of northeast of Macedonia. And then we had Seleucus, who was ruling in Mesopotamia. And what we think of that as modern-day Syria or Iraq. And we had Ptolemy, who was the most prominent of all of Alexander's generals. He was controlling all of Egypt. And so they were spread to the four winds. He had lost it, he had died, and his empire was just spread amongst his generals. And of course, that's the genesis of all these arguments and battles and conflicts that we read about in these Syrian wars that are to come. So verse 5, the king of the south, that's a reference to the Ptolemy, and he ruled Egypt from 322 to 285 BC, and he held himself out to be the true pharaoh of Egypt. Even though he was a Greek, he started worshiping the Egyptian gods, and he had Alexander's body brought there, and Alexander the Great's body brought to Egypt and buried in Alexandria. And it's interesting that we talked about Seleucus being the ruler of Mesopotamia or Syria, Iraq, in that area. Ptolemy appointed him the ruler of that. Seleucus started out as the weakest of the generals, and Ptolemy was the one who actually appointed him the ruler of that, the eastern part of the kingdom. So as we continue to think about that, one of his princes shall be stronger than he and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. There were a series of battles and wars between these generals, and it was Diadochi Wars. And it was just where they're just battling one another as if they didn't have enough territory. Their egos were so amazing that they kept trying to gain more and more territory. So there was a great conflict between Antiochus in Turkey, Asia Minor, and Seleucus over in the Syria, Mesopotamia area. And Seleucus lost that battle, and he had to retreat and go back to Egypt and seek Ptolemy's help, because he just got whipped and he was sent back. But it didn't last but a few years, and he went back and invaded Babylonia with Ptolemy's help, and he wound up gaining more territory than he had before. So when it talks about, the text said, he shall be stronger and shall rule. He lost for a few years, he went back, and he gained more territory than he had in the beginning. So he's getting stronger, but that wasn't the end of it. And there was a series of battles, the Battle of Ipsus in central Turkey, and the battle at Lysippicus near Sardis. Remember Sardis, one of the 7 churches of Asia? Then there was another battle there, and he winds up being the last man standing, and he has more territory than any. Now he's the most powerful king of the 4 generals that came out of Alexandria, out of Alexander the Great's generals. So now you can see he had a setback for a couple years. Then in a matter of a few years, he has conquered more territory, and all the area you see in yellow, he controls all of that territory. Now the text says that he will become stronger. He certainly did, and now he's the most powerful king. And of course, now we're going to see the concentration in these Syrian wars is between Seleucus or the Syrian forces and the Egyptian forces. And remember, Jerusalem is just caught in the middle of all of this. So there's a gap in these Syrian wars. You know, I put that slide up. There were 6 Syrian wars. The first and second Syrian wars occur between verse 5 and verse 6. So there's quite a gap in history. But we wanted to talk about that just because it kind of sets up what's going on. So in the first Syrian war, which was 274 to 271 BC, again, this is between verse 5 and 6, Seleucus was trying to conquer Macedonia and Thrace. He's tried to go up out of Turkey over into Europe, and conquer more territory, and he was murdered while he was attempting to do that. And we even know the date. He was murdered in September of 281 BC. And of course, he succeeded then by Antiochus I. Seleucus was succeeded by Antiochus. In the same time down in Egypt, Ptolemy the first is replaced by Ptolemy II. So we've had a regime change in both countries. But the result of the first Syrian war was it was a great victory for Egypt and the Ptolemies, and they gained along the coast in Phoenicia all the way up into Asia Minor. So that was a big setback for the Syrians. And then again, the second Syrian war happens, about 10 years later, so 260 to 253. And again, this is between verses 5 and 6. And we have Antiochus II succeeding his father, and he launched an attack against Egypt and the Ptolemy forces on their outpost in western Asia Minor, or Turkey. And again, just think, this whole area is just a battleground. It's not just in that little area around between them, what we think of modern-day Israel or Gaza. It's the whole area just becomes a great battleground. They have these outposts, and so Antiochus launches an attack on the Egyptians, and the Egyptians lost a lot of ground in that. And so in 253 BC, we see the first of this, where one's daughter's given to the king to try and create a peace treaty. So Antiochus II is given to Bernice. Ptolemy's daughter Bernice is given to Antiochus II. So you have this Egyptian Bernice given to Antiochus II as a wife to seal the treaty to try and stop the war. And that was quite a problem, because he already had a wife, Laodicea. The city of Laodicea was named after her. Bernice is given, and of course Antiochus puts her, Laodicea, aside, divorces her, and that causes lots of problems. And we'll move on. So verse 6 now, we're back into the text, verse 6, and let's read that. After some years, they, referring to Ptolemy II and Antiochus II, shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south, that's referring to Bernice, shall come to the king of the north, referring to Antiochus II, to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm. She's going to be deposed and set down. And he and his arm, Antiochus II, shall not endure. He's poisoned. But she, Bernice, shall be given up, assassinated, and her attendants, her Syrian advocates, he who fathered her, Ptolemy II's treaty, and he who supported her in those times, Ptolemy III, her brother. I put those in your handout because it's so he and they and who, so you can kind of understand what's going on. So, as we said, one thing I want to point out is after the first Syrian war, Egypt gained control over Jerusalem. And for 100 years after that, Jerusalem was under Egyptian control. It's just something we want to keep in our mind. And so when it says in the start of verse 6, after some years, we've skipped ahead 20 years chronologically. We've jumped ahead 20 years in the timeline. So in verse 6, it says, the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. Of course, that's a reference to Bernice, who was given to Antiochus II in marriage. And of course, everyone was happy about that except Laodicea. And she was not happy because she got kicked out as the king's wife. And but when Ptolemy II died, then Antiochus thought, well, so I'm not going to honor this peace treaty anymore. And he decides to get rid of Bernice and take Laodicea back. And but she just promptly poisoned him. You know, she'd been treated badly when Bernice came in, and she poisoned Antiochus. And at the same time, down in Egypt, Ptolemy III had heard about his sister Bernice, how she was treated, and he decides to attack the Syrians. And that's the Third Syrian War. And his goal was to come up and rescue his sister. And she had had a son there who should have been the rightful heir to the throne, and he wants to rescue her and put her son on the throne. Of course, that would have been great because the Egyptians would have then been controlling Syria too, because Bernice was Egyptian and her son was half Egyptian, and so he decides to come up and attack. So that's the Third Syrian War. So in verse 7, the text says, "And from a branch of her," referring to Bernice, "roots one, Ptolemy III shall arise in his," talking about his place, Seleucus II, "and he shall come with the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail." Well, Ptolemy III comes to Syria, and he goes all the way into when it talks about the fortress of the king of the north, he goes all the way to Babylon. It's a major victory for the Ptolemy, and this is the height of the Egyptian kingdom during this period of time, is this Third Syrian War. We'll read about this, and when he said he shall come against his army, and this is the height of the Egyptians in this battle between the two. And of course, Bernice winds up being murdered, and Laodice murdered her and her son, and it's sometimes referred to as the War of Laodice, because she took vengeance out after all of this, and it was quite the coup, and it's just a battle for regimes. Moving on to verse 8. He said, the text says, "He," and this is talking about Ptolemy III, "he shall carry off to Egypt their gods and their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, and for some years he shall retain from attacking the king of the north. Then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land." So Ptolemy, when he left Babylon, he took home spoils of war. He carried off the Syrian gods that are made of gold and silver. He carried all those back to Egypt. And Seleucus attempted to retaliate at the end of the Third Syrian War, but he wasn't successful. So verse 10, "His son shall wage war and assemble a great multitude of forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as the fortress. Then the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north, and he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand." And this is a reference to the Fourth Syrian War that went on for just a couple years, from 219 to 217 BC. His sons refers to Ptolemy IV and Antiochus III, and again, you've moved 20 years ahead. And this war started when Antiochus III recaptured cities in Phoenicia, including Tyre, but rather than invading Egypt, he waited in Phoenicia over a year and let his army get stronger, and he was kind of listening to what was going on in Egypt. And then in 217, Ptolemy IV, the king of the south, engaged and defeated Antiochus in the Battle of Raphia. And so this text, it talks about the king of the south shall move with rage and just come out and fight against the king of the north. And so we're seeing this great battle take place between these two forces. And Raphia is really kind of in the area, we keep hearing all this about Gaza today. It's really kind of in that area today. It's kind of the no man's land between Israel and Egypt. And this battle took place in 217 BC. And We're going to talk about Antiochus III in just a minute because he really sets up to understand who he is, sets up things we'll talk about in the next section of Daniel chapter 11. But Antiochus III, or Antiochus the Great, took control of Palestine, and he pressed towards Egypt, and Ptolemy countered. And we even know this from history. He had 5,000 cavalry, 65,000 in infantry, and he had army tanks too. He had 73 African elephants. And Antiochus had fewer than 10,000 cavalry. But Antiochus was defeated, and the conflict between Egypt and Syria continued for several more years. Said the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north. So that's exactly what's happening here. And it's interesting that just through history that we even know how many men fought in these battles. But we don't often think about that they used African elephants is like tanks. We would like to use tanks in battle today, but that was these amazing superpowers battling one another, and there's Jerusalem caught in the middle of all of this. So Antiochus III, we were introduced to him here in this verses 10 and 11, and he was a great man. And one of the things that we want to, in his children that we're going to see as we move forward this, is Seleucus IV Philopator. He's the next ruler. But then we're going to talk about in the next lessons Cleopatra. And of course, we really think of Cleopatra as being an Egyptian. Well, Cleopatra is not an Egyptian. Cleopatra is a Syrian. It's the same kind of deal. She's given to one of the Ptolemies as a bride. But we'll talk about that in the next. So Cleopatra is not an Egyptian. Cleopatra is a Syrian. And then his third son is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He is the most hated man in all of Jewish history for the abominations that he inflicted upon Jerusalem. And we're going to talk about that. That'll push us. We're talking about events here in 217. By the time we get down to Antiochus Epiphanes, we've moved down to 168 BC. So we've moved closer and closer to the time of Christ. So verse 12. Got just a few minutes more here to. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. So Ptolemy made peace with Antiochus in 211. So this is about 6 years after this great battle at Raphia in Gaza. In the war just kept going on. But it didn't end till 211 BC. But both 3rd Maccabees and Josephus record that Ptolemy stopped in Jerusalem as he returned to Egypt and decided to show what a great guy he was. And it's recorded that Simon the Just, the high priest, confronted Ptolemy when he wanted to go into the temple. And that resulted in a great retaliation against the whole nations. And he started persecuting the Jews. And of course, you remember I said after the first Syrian war that Egypt had control over Jerusalem for 100 years. And I think that had been kind of a peaceful thing and not a onerous thing on Jerusalem. And now Ptolemy IV comes in, and he decides to throw his weight around, and it winds up being he winds up persecuting the Jews. And so what had been a fairly benign thing now becomes a very serious thing for the Jews and a hardship for the Jews. And that's a result of this Fourth Syrian War. It seems like as you read this history, and as we think about other we study 1st and 2nd Kings and that sort of thing, you see that they didn't call on God and they had turned away from God. Well, as you read this intertestamental period, it seems as though the Jews were not calling upon God. They were just content with whether it was Egypt or Syria. If they were treating them well, it was like, okay, as long as they're treating us well, we don't care. And they really didn't call upon God. And of course, in Luke chapter 21, I think when that Luke's account of the Olivet Discourse, that's where Jesus talks about that the time of Jerusalem being trampled underfoot and to the time of the Gentiles ended. Well, we see here that Ptolemy IV was trampling underfoot Jerusalem and how he treated them as he came back from defeating the Syrians. So verse 13 and 14 real quickly. For the king of the north shall raise a multitude greater than the first, and after some years he shall come with a great army and abundant supplies. Well, this is a reference to the 5th Syrian War from 202 to 195. And again, remember, Daniel had his vision in 534 BC, and now God has revealed to Daniel things that we can look back on and see. In the Jews in the 1st century could have looked back and seen this unfolding of history that God had told Daniel about in such detail that if you're a student of history, you can understand exactly who these people were. So the king of the north, this is 15 years later. We've moved ahead 15 years. Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great, he had assembled a much greater army. They don't ever give up. These kings don't ever give up. It's like, I'm going to go back and get this. So he amassed a much greater army and decided to take advantage of some chaos that was going on with the transfer of power in Egypt and a very young king, and there was turmoil there. And he staged a second invasion in Kole, Syria. We talked about that little area, modern-day Lebanon, Syria. And he swept through the region, and he conquered the Ptolemies at the Battle of Panium. And it earned him even the port of Sidon. He's getting over on the west coast of Israel and gaining those lands. But the Romans were opposed to this. By this time, the Romans are becoming more and more a power player. And they were opposed to him conquering Egypt because they didn't want their grain supply disrupted, because, they'd come out of the Nile Delta River area where all the wheat and grain were grown, and it would go to the Roman empires, to Ephesus and over to Greece and Rome. And Ptolemy V signed a treaty with Antiochus in 195, and he agreed to marry Antiochus' daughter, Cleopatra I. And we'll talk more about that as we move forward. But there's Cleopatra the Syrian is given to the king, the Ptolemy V. So verse 14, and that's about as far as we'll get tonight. In those times, many shall rise against the king of the south, and the violent among your own people, speaking of the Jews, shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. So there was chaos in Egypt at this time, and even parts of the Egyptian kingdom were in revolt against the leaders of Egypt. And it appears that, and from Josephus and other historians, that the Jews joined into this. Remember, they're still under control of the Egyptians. Well, they joined into this revolt. And some think it was a misguided thing, that they were thinking about the time of the Messiah coming and that kind of thing. But they rose up against the Egyptians. The Jews rose up against the Egyptians. And a lot of this is recorded in Maccabees. And this is the moment where Jerusalem shifted from being under Egyptian control to being under Syrian control. And they welcomed that, and now Antiochus III is controlling Jerusalem. And of course, as you move forward, his third son will become ruler over Jerusalem and does some heinous things that we'll study in the next lesson. I know this is a really tedious thing. I hope the handouts are helpful, but it's just, when you think about all this, I don't think it's that we should be able to remember every detail of all this, but it's amazing to think the detail is, if you know a little bit about history that's revealed to Daniel in all these kings of the north and kings of the south and these great battles and conflicts that are going on. And they're literally hundreds of years in the future. God knew everything that was going to happen between these great nations, but it's all leading up to the time of the Messiah in the eternal kingdom. He's telling Daniel exactly what's going to happen. And we said this before in our class. They came out of 70 years of captivity, but they're still being disciplined by God, by these Gentile nations. And it's all leading to Jerusalem be trampled underfoot on the time of the end of the Gentiles. So thank you for your attention. I know this wasn't really a class to have a lot of interaction, but I hope it's been helpful to help you understand Daniel chapter 11. We'll pick up and we'll cover about the next 15 verses on Sunday, and then we'll finish up a week from tonight. Thank you.